The legend of the Sands of Time begins with a young, nameless prince standing on a ridge overlooking the opulent Maharaja's palace in India. He is a youth defined by a desperate, burning desire for legacy. In the lore of the House of Shahraman, a prince is nothing until he has proven himself in the fires of conquest. Beside him is his father, King Shahraman, a man of iron and honor, who has launched this invasion not for mere gold, but for the glory of the Persian Empire. However, the true architect of the conflict is the vizier, a traitorous advisor to the Maharaja who has promised the Persians untold riches in exchange for his own survival. The lore of the vizier is the story of mortality's fear. He is a dying man, his body withered by age and disease, searching for a way to cheat the grave. He directs the Persian army toward the Maharaja's most guarded secret, a vault containing a gargantuan, golden hourglass and a crystalline dagger. During the chaotic siege of the palace, the prince separates from the main vanguard, driven by the reckless ambition of youth. He infiltrates the Maharaja's private treasury, a place the lore describes as the sanctum of frozen time. There, he discovers the Dagger of Time. To the prince, it is a beautiful trophy, a blade with a translucent hilt filled with a glowing golden vapor. To the vizier, it is the key to the universe. The lore of the dagger is that it is the only vessel capable of harvesting and controlling the raw essence of the sands. The prince, unaware of the cosmic weight of the object, claims it as his own, narrowly escaping a collapsing vault. This is the first stitch in the shroud of fate. By taking the dagger, the prince has inadvertently become the guardian of the very force that will soon destroy everything he holds dear. The Persian army returns to the Sultan's palace in Azad, carrying the hourglass as a gift for their ally. This is where the lore of the Sands of Time is truly unveiled. The vizier, playing on the Sultan's curiosity and King Shahraman's pride, convinces the prince to use the dagger to unseal the hourglass. He claims it will reveal a marvel that will make the Sultan's name immortal. Despite a warning from a captive Indian princess, Farah, the prince plunges the dagger into the seal. In that moment, the Pandora's box of Persia is opened. The sands are not a treasure, they are a temporal plague. As they erupt from the glass, they do not merely kill, they rewrite. Every living soul in the palace, including the king and the sultan, is instantly transformed into a horrific, sand-fleshed monster, trapped in a state of eternal, mindless agony. The prince remains unchanged only because he holds the dagger, while Farah is spared by her enchanted medallion and the vizier by his mystical staff. The lore of the sand dwellers is one of absolute tragedy. These creatures are the echoes of the living, soldiers and servants who are now puppets of the sands, compelled to kill any living being to absorb their life force. The prince stands in the ruins of the grand ballroom, watching his father turn into a sand-shrouded beast. The warrior's dream has become a living nightmare. The vizier demands the dagger, revealing his true intent, to use the sands to become an immortal god. The prince, spurred by a sudden, sharp clarity of guilt, refuses and flees into the depths of the palace. The journey begins here, not as a quest for glory, but as a desperate struggle for atonement. The architecture of the Azad Palace becomes a character in its own right, a sprawling labyrinth of shattered grandeur. The lore of the Palace of Azad is that it was built as a celebration of life, but it has now become a tomb where gravity and time are no longer stable. The prince must navigate collapsing towers and trap-filled corridors, realizing that the sands are slowly eroding the very reality of the world. He encounters Farah, and though their kingdoms were at war, they realize they are the only two people left who remember the world as it was. Their relationship is built on the lore of shared trauma and fragile trust. Farah knows the secret of the sands, while the prince holds the power to reverse them. Together, they begin the long ascent toward the top of the palace, where the hourglass has been moved, hoping to find a way to turn back the clock before the sands spread beyond the city walls and consume the world. The second chapter of the lore follows the prince and Farah as they navigate the hollowed-out carcass of the Palace of Azad. The environment, once a symbol of the Sultan's hospitality, has been twisted into a liminal trap. The sands have permeated the very foundations, causing stone to float and time to stutter in localized pockets. The lore of this segment focuses on the burden of the medallion and the dagger, the two artifacts that prevent the prince and Farah from becoming the very monsters they are forced to slay. As they move through the sultan's private baths and the vast, hanging libraries, the prince is forced to confront the ghosts of his ambition. Every sand dweller he strikes down was once a person he knew, a soldier he commanded or a servant who poured his wine. This constant violence is a mirror of consequence, showing him the literal cost of his desire for glory. The relationship between the prince and Farah evolves into the emotional heart of the story, defined by the lore of the archer and the swordsman. Farah is not a helpless captive. She is the last survivor of a civilization that understood the sands far better than the Persians. She represents the wisdom of the East, constantly challenging the prince's impulsive nature. Their interactions are a delicate dance of suspicion and growing affection. The prince, used to being obeyed, must learn to listen. Farah, used to her role as a princess, must learn to trust the son of her kingdom's destroyer. This alliance of the damned is tested as they reach the Hall of Learning, where the vizier's influence is strongest. Here, the lore of the visions of the Hourglass begins to haunt the prince. He sees flashes of a potential future where he is a king, but a king of ruins. The architecture of the palace reflects this internal struggle, particularly in the Great Tower of Azad. The climb is a vertical pilgrimage, moving from the dark, blood-stained pits of the dungeons toward the light of the upper towers. The lore of the acrobat's grace is central here. The prince's ability to defy gravity is not just a skill, but a metaphor for his attempt to rise above his own mistakes. However, the sands are a heavy anchor. The prince begins to rely on the dagger's power to recall time, undoing fatal falls and combat errors. The lore of temporal regression is introduced as a dangerous addiction. Every time the prince turns back the clock, he is essentially refusing to accept the finality of his actions. Farah serves as his moral compass, reminding him that the only true way forward is to reach the hourglass and reset the world properly, rather than living in a loop of his own failures. The act culminates in the Sultan's menagerie, where the prince faces a transformed creature of immense power, the Sand King Shahraman. This is the narrative's moment of absolute loss. The prince is forced to fight the mutated remains of his own father. The lore of this battle is the death of the father image. To save himself and Farah, the prince must strike down the man whose approval he once craved more than life itself. As the king dissolves into a pile of golden dust, the prince's youth officially ends. He is no longer fighting for his father's legacy. He is fighting for his own soul. This tragedy solidifies his bond with Farah, as she is the only one who can witness his grief. They stand on the high balconies of the menagerie, looking up at the hourglass glowing like a dark sun at the summit, realizing that the vizier is not their only enemy. The weight of their own history is just as heavy. The third movement of the lore finds the prince and Farah within the royal chambers and the subterranean aqueducts, a journey that transitions from a physical climb to a psychological immersion. After the devastating loss of King Shahraman, the prince's bravado has completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet, brooding vulnerability. The lore of the Bond of the Nameless is explored here. In the quiet moments between the clashing of blades, the prince and Farah share stories of their childhoods, not as royals, but as children. Farah tells him of her mother and the secret word of Kakalukia, a symbol of safety and childhood wonder. This word becomes the anchor of humanity in a world that has become unrecognizable. The prince, in turn, begins to see Farah not as a prize of war or a tactical asset, but as the only thing that makes his continued existence meaningful. Their relationship is the lore's sacred flame, the only light in a palace that has been consumed by the vizier's shadow. As they descend into the deep wells to find a path around the vizier's magical barriers, the atmosphere shifts from grand tragedy to claustrophobic horror. The lore of the underworld of Azad reveals the physical decay of the palace foundations. The sands have seeped into the water table, creating sandbat swarms and mutated creatures that dwell in the dark. In these lightless depths, the prince's reliance on the dagger's glow is his only comfort. However, the tension between duty and desire reaches a breaking point. The prince begins to fear that if he succeeds in reversing time, he will lose Farah, for in a world where the sands were never released, they would still be enemies, and she would still be his prisoner. This paradox of the heart makes the prince hesitate, a momentary lapse in resolve that the vizier's magic begins to exploit. The act reaches its climax in a sequence of profound betrayal, not from Farah, but from the prince's own exhaustion. After a grueling battle in the statue of the Sultan, the prince and Farah find themselves in a hidden tomb. While the prince sleeps, overcome by the physical toll of his journey, Farah takes the dagger. The lore of Farah's choice is often misunderstood as a simple theft, but it is actually an act of altruistic desperation. She realizes the prince's hesitation and fears that his love for her will stop him from doing what is necessary. She takes the dagger to face the Hourglass alone, leaving him with her medallion to protect him from the sands. The prince awakens in the dark, stripped of his weapon and his partner, facing the ultimate night of the soul. He must navigate the final traps of the palace without the ability to turn back time, forced to face the finality of death for the first time since the journey began. Part 4: The Hourglass of Atonement and the Reset of Fate. The final chapter of the Sands of Time lore takes place at the apex of the Great Tower, where the Hourglass stands as a pillar of golden light against the starlit sky. The prince, having fought through the darkness with nothing but his father's sword and his own grit, arrives just in time to see Farah's final stand. The lore of the sacrifice of the archer is the narrative's emotional peak. Farah, attempting to strike the Hourglass, is overwhelmed by the sand dwellers. She falls from the heights of the tower, and the prince, reaching for her, can only catch the blade of the dagger as she slips away. Her death is the final price of hubris. The prince stands alone atop the world, holding the dagger, looking at the vizier who offers him everything: immortality, power, and the life of his father, if he will only hand over the blade. The lore of the decision of the prince is the rejection of the vizier's nihilism. The prince realizes that the only way to honor Farah and his father is to erase the version of himself that caused their deaths. He plunges the dagger into the top of the Hourglass, uttering the word Kakalukia. This act triggers the Great Rewind, a cosmic reversal of every event since the Maharaja's palace. The world unspools. The dead are brought back to life, the ruins are rebuilt, and the sands are sucked back into the glass. The lore of the temporal reset is that only the prince, as the one who struck the final blow, retains his memories. He wakes up in the Persian camp on the night before the invasion, a man with the soul of a veteran in the body of a youth. The story concludes with a clandestine meeting. The prince infiltrates the Maharaja's palace, not as a conqueror, but as a messenger. He finds Farah in her gardens and tells her the entire story, warning her of the vizier's treachery. The lore of this final dialogue is a masterclass in bittersweet resolution. Farah does not know him, yet she feels a strange pull toward the stranger who speaks with such sorrow. When the vizier arrives to kill them both, the prince slays him in a duel of pure, unbridled skill, finally ending the threat that started it all. The prince returns the dagger to Farah, and as he disappears into the forest, she asks him his name. He responds with the only word that proves his story was true: Kakalukia. The legacy of the Sands of Time lore is the story of a hero who never was. The prince saved the world, but in doing so, he ensured that no one would ever know of his heroism. He is a king without a chronicle, carrying the weight of a deleted decade in his heart. The palace of Azad remains unruined, his father remains alive, and Farah remains safe. But the prince is forever changed. A man who's seen the face of time and emerged with the wisdom that some treasures are better left buried in the sand. To truly grasp the finality of the Sands of Time and the heavy transition into the epilogue of dust, one must zoom out from the corridors of Azad and look into the metaphysical framework of the universe itself. This overview is the final, essential chapter in the lore of the prince's youth, a deep dive into the hidden mechanics of a reality that was broken and then stitched back together with a needle made of golden sand. The lore of the temporal loom suggests that time in this universe is not a rigid, unchangeable river, but a fragile tapestry of possible threads. When the prince plunged the dagger of time into the great hourglass, he didn't just release a physical substance. He committed a divine trespass, tearing a hole in the very logic of existence. The sands are not merely magic. They are the primal fabric of the universe in a raw, unrefined state. In their natural form, they are the breath of the world, but when filtered through the vizier's malice and the prince's desperation, they became a temporal infection that sought to rewrite the world into a chaotic, mindless reflection of its own trauma. The central pillar of this overview is the concept of the burden of the singular witness. In the lore of the sands, memory is the only anchor that remains when time is unspooled. This is the tragic core of the prince's character development. While the Great Rewind restored the dead and rebuilt the palace, it did not, and could not erase the shadow timeline from the prince's mind. To every other living soul in Persia and India, the catastrophe at Azad never happened. To King Shahraman, the war was a routine conquest. To the Sultan, the hourglass was just an exotic curiosity. But for the prince, the world is a graveyard of memories that no longer exist. This creates a dual existence, where the prince is a man living in a world that is essentially a ghost of his own making. He is forced to walk through the palace halls and see the faces of guards he saw mutated into monsters, and servants he saw murdered, now smiling and going about their day. This dissonance of reality is what transforms the prince from the vibrant, arrogant boy of the intro into the brooding, hyper-vigilant warrior. He is the only man on earth who knows how close the world came to absolute annihilation. The role of the vizier in this metaphysical overview is that of the eternal catalyst of decay. Even though he is executed by the prince at the end of the game, the lore posits that the vizier is a recurring archetype of human hubris. He represents the universal fear of death, the terror of the final second. In every version of the timeline, there is a man who seeks to steal time to hide his own mortality. The vizier is the mirror image of the prince. While the prince uses the dagger to fix his mistakes and save others, the vizier uses the dagger to feed his own ego. Their struggle is the symmetry of the dagger, a battle between the desire to control the future and the courage to accept the past. The vizier's death is not just a tactical victory. It is a rejection of the idea that time is a resource to be hoarded. However, as the prince later learns in the Forgotten Chronicles, the death of one vizier does not heal the temporal scar left on the world. The void left by the sands is like a vacuum, drawing in darker, more primordial forces like the Dahaka. The lore also explores the anointing of the flesh. Because the prince held the dagger during the Great Rewind, his physical body has been tinged by the sands. This is a crucial piece of lore that explains his near-superhuman agility and his sixth sense for danger. He is no longer purely human. He has become a temporal anomaly. His eyes carry a faint, golden hue that only appears in low light, and his heartbeat is said to pulse with the rhythmic grinding of the hourglass. This anointed status is what makes him a target for the universe's natural immune system. The lore of the debt of the rewind suggests that the universe tracks every second that is stolen or undone. By saving his own life and the life of his father, the prince has created a massive temporal deficit. The overview reveals that the peace he finds at the end of the sands of time is not a resolution, but a stay of execution. He is a man living on borrowed time, and the interest on that loan is paid in the darkness and dread that begins to haunt his dreams in Babylon. Finally, we must examine the legacy of the word, Kakalukia. This word is more than just a childhood memory of Farah. In the lore, it is the vibrational key that proves the impossible is true. When the prince whispers this word to Farah in the final scene, he is performing an act of metaphysical proof. It is the only thing that survives the rewind, a bridge between the timeline that was destroyed and the timeline that was restored. It represents the incorruptibility of the soul, No matter how many times time is turned back, certain truths, like the prince's love for Farah and his growth from a boy to a man, cannot be undone. This is the unbreakable thread. The prince leaves the Maharaja's palace not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of a secret history. He accepts the silence and the loneliness of his heroism because he understands that the greatest acts of bravery are those that the world will never have to know about. This overview concludes the Sands of Time era by highlighting the bittersweet sovereignty of the prince. He has saved the world, but he has lost his place in it. He is a king without a chronicle, a hero without a song, standing on the threshold of a new, darker age. The golden light of the sands is fading, replaced by the long, cold shadows of the Dahaka. The prince looks at the sunset over India and realizes that while he has escaped the hourglass, he has not escaped the clock. The war for his survival is only just beginning, and the warrior within is starting to stir in the silence of his secret.